When we study the book of Genesis, it can be outlined this way. There are 3 periods out of the 15 that we find in the book of Genesis: the antediluvian period, the post-diluvian period, and then, of course, the patriarchal period. Now, when we think about that antediluvian period in the book of Genesis, that's, of course, from Adam to Noah. And then when we think about that post-diluvian period, that's that cataclysmic flood, Noah, and then, of course, after Noah, all the way to the patriarchal period, and that would be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then you certainly have to parenthetically insert Judas because of Genesis 38 and, of course, Genesis 49. Now, when we think about that, the outline of the book of Genesis, in the first 6 chapters, you have to keep your eyes, or the first 5 chapters, you keep your eyes on a man called Adam. The Bible deals with 2 worlds, the world prior to sin and the world subsequent to sin. And what a great world that was before sin came. In Genesis 3, 1-6, there was no killing, no eating of meats, no arguing in marriage, and none of those types of things. What a beautiful world that was. Now, when we think about that, as God looked down on the lonely condition of man before he even made woman, in Genesis 2, we see that God made man out of the dust of the ground, breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life. Then, of course, man became a living soul. Then, of course, we see in Genesis 2 and verse 8, he takes the man and placed him in the garden, gave man that home. What a beautiful home that was. In Genesis 2 and verse 15, God tells this man, I want you to dress that garden and I want you to keep it. And therefore, we see the work ethic begins, how God made man to be busy. First, give him that home, the Garden of Eden. Then, of course, give him a job in verse 15. He is to dress that garden. Then, of course, he is to keep it. Then, of course, in Genesis 2 and verse 16, God says, out of all the trees out here, you can freely eat. But the tree of good and evil, that's one in the midst of the garden. Don't eat of that one. For the day you eat thereof, thou shalt surely die. Notice the beginnings here, because that's what the word Genesis means. First, he makes man out of the dust of the ground, Genesis 2 and verse 7. Gave man a job, verse number 15. Then he gave that man, after he gave him that home in verse 8, which was the Garden of Eden, gave that man a job. Then he gave that man divine instructions how to run that home in verse 16. And of course, now God is getting ready to perform the first marital ceremony. It was God that performed the first marital ceremony. It was God that gave the first bride into marriage. So in verse number 18, now remember, before he consummated marriage, gave that man a home. Verse 8, gave that man a job to take care of that home and that wife. In verse number 15, and then gave that man some divine instructions how to run that home. In verse 18, God looked down on the lonely condition of man and said, it is not good that man should be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him. And of course, we know God put Adam to sleep, took a rib out of his side, made him a woman. He says, this is now flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And then he says, what therefore God hath joined together. And verse 24, let not man put asunder. What a marvelous, marvelous condition we have before us. We have God's structure, the beginning of the home. We have God's structure for marriage. We have God's structure for taking care of that home. Have God's structure for how to run that home with those divine instructions. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. Chapter 3 and verse 1, he said unto the woman, yea, hath God said, ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden. And the woman said unto the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, ye shall not surely die, for God doth know in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open. Ye shall be as gods, knowing both good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and that she did eat, gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. This is the first sin that man commits. Now that sin of the tree in that garden did not catch God off guard, because God always had a scheme of redemption, a plan in his mind before the world was ever created. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 9, also in Ephesians 1 verses 4 through 7. So God had a scheme of redemption in his mind before sin ever came in the Garden of Eden. But this is the first sin that was known to man, a man committed. Not the first sin. We know that was a violation of God's law in heaven. For if God spared not the angels that sinned against him in heaven, but cast them down into Tartarus, into hell and chains of darkness reserved there for the judgment. Now when those heavenly bodies sinned, God prepared a place for them to spend eternity. Matthew 25:41. He prepared hell for the devil and his angels. Didn't devise a scheme of redemption for those heavenly bodies. But now when man sinned in Genesis 3:1 through 6, in verse 15, we have God's first hint of redeeming mankind back from his sins. Now, in verse number 15, I will put enmity, that is warfare. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. That's the first messianic hint, the first messianic prophecy that God is going to redeem mankind back from his sins. Genesis 3:1 to 6. It's interesting to observe that out of all of those trees in the garden, however many they were, you can freely eat of those trees. But the one tree that Eve couldn't have, it so got her attention that she forgot all about those trees that she could have. God was so good, he gave all of those trees out here. You can eat of all of them, but just the one. It got her attention, so she forgot about all of the trees that she could have. And she was so interested in the one tree that she couldn't have. And it doomed mankind. Wherefore by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. Romans 5 and verse 12. That's a direct reference back to Genesis 3:1 to 6. So now we have this antediluvian period here, where from Adam to the end of Genesis chapter 5. Now when you come to this post-diluvian period, of course, we think about this now. From Adam and that first messianic prophecy that God is going to save the world through the seed of woman. According to Genesis 3 and verse 15. He's going to do it through this seed line. How is that to be done if there is only two people in the world, came full grown? And of course, Adam and Eve was not crawling around on the tree, on the garden floor. But the devil has both of them now. And of course, Adam knew his wife, bare two boys, Cain and Abel. But right after that, Cain killed Abel. Now, how is Genesis 3:15 going to get into the world? If now there's only three people in the world, and the devil have all three of them. Adam, Eve, Cain. Abel was the one that was righteous, according to Hebrews 11 and verse 4. So Adam knew his wife again, go back and have another son by the name of Seth, which is the seed of promise. The seed of promise. He's going to take Genesis 3:15 that God's going to use to get Jesus Christ, because that is a messianic prophecy concerning King Jesus the Christ. In Genesis 3 and verse 15. And it's interesting to observe that Seth has a boy by the name of Enos, E-N-O-S. And now it's going to come all the way down through Enos, and then Canaan, and then Mahalalel, and then of course Mahalalel has a son named Jared. Then Jared has a son by the name of Enoch. And Enoch has a son by the name of Methuselah. Of course, Methuselah has a son by the name of Lamech, and Lamech has a son by the name of Noah. And that's where you come in Genesis chapter 6. In Genesis 6 and verse 5, that one period from Seth to now Noah was a righteous period. But Genesis 6 and verse 5, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of the hearts of men was only evil continuously. Now the world is right back into sin. And God says in verse number 8, I'm going to destroy the world. Well, God, you can't do that. Because if you do that, how is Genesis 3:15 is going to get in the world to save man from his sins of which he has no solution? But Noah, verse 8, found grace in the eyes of the Lord. In Hebrews 11, Noah prepared an ark for the saving of his house. And that's exactly what happens. And as a result, my brother Peter said something about that in 1 Peter 3 and verse 20, which sometimes with disobedience, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, you had 120-year period according to Genesis 6 and verse 3, that God was long suffering because of the sin in the world. Waited in the days of Noah. How long? Verse 3 of Genesis 6, 120 years. While the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is, was saved by water. I wonder, do we believe that? You think about that. I don't know what the population was in that post-Diluvian period. But out of all of those people, Peter says only 8 souls were saved. I would say that's few, wouldn't you? They refused to adhere to the preaching of Noah. He only had one sermon. He was very, very fortunate. Come on, get in this ark. It's going to rain. Can you imagine that? Would you allow Brother Bill Bard to preach the same sermon for 120 years? Noah preached that same sermon. 120 years. Get into this ark. And we somehow preach same invitation songs, same invitation, same gospel. There's a day of reckoning. Only Noah, Mrs. Noah, Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives was obedient to the word of God. 2 Peter 2 and verse 5, Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Of righteousness. That one man found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And God, in his long suffering 120 years, through the preaching of Noah, trying to encourage those people to get in that ark. They did not want to adhere the message of Noah. It's going to rain. Can you imagine? Noah, what's rain? Can you imagine all of the questions? What does it do when it rains, Noah? From that point into this post-Diluvian period, no water had fell from the sky. The only water we read about is all the way back in Genesis 2 where a mist came up out of the ground when God used that mist to make that stick dirt to make man. And here Noah preaching that sermon. It's going to rain. Can you imagine the questions? What does it do when it rains, Noah? What are you talking about? Can you imagine Noah building that boat, that ark? Noah didn't even live geographically close to a body of water. Can you imagine the ridicule? God's message through Noah. It's going to rain. Noah, how you going to get that big old boat there to the closest body of water? How you going to do that, Noah? Can you imagine them laughing at Noah? I want to tell you something, friend. Noah didn't have to get that boat to a body of water. God brought the water to the boat. Can you imagine all of those people trying to get into the ark when that water started ascending? When that water started descending? But it was too late. God had the key. And as a result, now Genesis 3:15 is still active. I'm going to put enmity. I'm going to put warfare between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, thou shalt bruise his heel. And so this cataclysmic baptismal measure of the flood baptized and cleansed the earth. Now the earth is back pure again until you get to Genesis chapter 10 at the Tower of Babel. And now the world has become so very wicked again. Noah, wife, past childbearing years. How is the earth is going to be replenished? Well, in Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Of course, Shem with his 5 boys, Elam, Ashur, Aphexad, Lud, and Aram. And then you have Ham with his 4 boys, Cush, Put, Mizraim, and Canaan. And then you got Japheth and his 4 boys, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. But it's not going to come, that seed line, through the Hamites, Ham, his 4 boys. Nor is it going to, Genesis 3:15, going to come through the Japhethites, that's Japhet, his 7 boys. And it's not going to even come through all of the Shemites, which was Elam, Ashur, Aphexad, Lud, and Aram. It's only going to come through one of those boys, according to Genesis chapter 10. It's going to come through the Shemites, but not all. Shem, then his 1 boy, Aphexad, then Salah, then Eber, then Peleg, then Reu, then Serub, and then Serub had a son by the name of Nahor. Then Nahor has a boy by the name of Terah. And then Terah has a boy by the name of who class? Who class? Abraham. Now, that will bring us to the last verse of Genesis 11. The last verse of Genesis 11 and the first 3 verses of Genesis 12. That will bring us to the close of the post-diluvian period, to the patriarchal period in the book of Genesis. Now, here, everything that we study in the Bible, everything, it hangs on the prophecy of Genesis 3:15 and the promise of Genesis 12:1-3. Everything. From Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22:21. Everything hangs on the prophecy of Genesis 3:15 I am going to save the world by my grace. By my grace. Of Genesis 3:15. That's a prophecy concerning Jesus Christ. Why? Because man have sinned in Genesis 3 and verse 6. Man of which he has no solution. Man does not have the solution for a sin problem. Only Jesus Christ had that solution. I'm going to save this whole world by my grace. That's through the seed of woman. When he exercised obedient faith, even in the Old Testament, of what Christ, of what God will do on the cross. Of what God will do on the cross. That's Old Testament. Now the same thing in the New Testament. I'm going to save everybody by my grace when they exercise obedient faith of what God has done on the cross. Of what God has done on the cross. Now think about this. Now in Genesis 12. In Genesis 12, now the Lord has said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Why leave your father's house, Terah? Because if you don't, Abraham, you're going to get yourself caught up in that idolatry. Now you're telling me to leave my father's house, Abraham. Abraham, or God, you're telling me to go where I'm going. I'll show you. I've given you enough information to start moving. Once you start moving, then I'll give you some additional information. You first got to start doing what I tell you to do. Start moving on what I've already said. Then once you get out there, I'll give you some more information. Abraham had to leave his father's house unto a land that I will show thee. Where I'm going, God? You just leave your father's house first. Be obedient to that. And then start walking. Be obedient to that. Then once you get out there, I'll give you further instructions. No wonder Abraham is called the father of faith of them that believe. See, faith is taking God at his word. Even when we don't have any evidence. Did Noah have any evidence of rain? Absolutely not. But he took God at his word. That's Bible faith. Bible faith has to come. Bible faith is something that's outside of us. It has to come. And it only comes by word. That's the only way it comes. If we can trust Paul, he the one said it. He was an inspired apostle, speaking on behalf of God. And that's what he says. So Bible, we take God at his word even when we do not have any evidence. So that's exactly what Abraham did. And so now, Genesis 3:15 is going to come down through Abraham. Now, we studied Abraham. Of course, his record is going to be found in the book of Genesis. In Genesis, the last verse of chapter 11, all the way to chapter 25. That will be your record in studying this great patriarch, Abraham. But it's interesting to observe. You remember in chapter 22 where God tells Abraham to go up to Mount Moriah, and God tells Abraham to take thine son, and God tells Abraham to take thine only son. But hold it, wait a minute, didn't Abraham have another boy? What was his name? Ishmael. But Ishmael was not the seed of promise. Take thine son, thine only son. Now Genesis 3:15 got to come through this boy. But God commissioned Abraham to take this boy up on Mount Moriah and cut his throat. Wait a minute, God, you can't do that. Because if you do that, how is Genesis 3:15 going to get in the world? To save mankind, that's you and me, from our sins, of which we have no solution. So many people today try to save themselves from their own sin. That's just not going to work. God has a plan, of which man has no solution to a sin problem. And you know the story, how Abraham got up early in the morning. I often thought about that. Did he actually get up early in the morning because Sarah perhaps may have been asleep? And he got the lad, and they headed up this mountain. They've worshiped God before. Because, of course, in that patriarchal dispensation, there was an altar system. Every father had to erect an altar to carry out their obedience to God. So they worshiped God before. Sunday didn't mean no more of those people in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. In that patriarchal dispensation. So they've worshiped God before. That's why when they get up there and Isaac says, we got the wood, we got everything, but where is the lamb of sacrifice? You it. You are it, Isaac. I often thought about that. I tell you, sometimes our human thinking kind of kicks in there, and since Abraham was an old man, I don't know, Abraham may have had to catch me. I tell you, that's a tough one. That's real tough. I tell you something else. How on earth? Because you know in Genesis 17, Abraham and Sarah had waited a long time for this boy. A long time for this boy. How is Abraham going to go back and tell that boy's mama, you done cut my son's throat? You ever thought about that? No wonder he is called the father of faith of them that believe. From that point, from Genesis 1:1 up until this point, there had never been a resurrection accorded in the Bible. In Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19, Abraham saw that boy coming back, resurrected in a figure. Explain that to me, Abraham. Abraham stood on what God said. What did God say? I'm going to make of thee a great nation. That's what God told Abraham. You see, bringing that boy back from the dead was not Abraham's problem. That was God's problem. Abraham's problem was, I'm going to do what God told me to do. And I got enough faith and belief in God that somehow God is going to work it out to get Genesis 3:15 in the world. Neighbor, that's faith. That's faith. No wonder Abraham is called the father of faith of them that believe. Romans 4, Galatians 4. It was not Abraham's problem to bring that boy back from the dead. It was God's problem, because God the one that said, I'm going to make of thee a great nation. I'm going to bless thee and make thy name great. Thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless thee that bless thee and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. That was God's problem. We have to do what God says. If God says, shepherd, I'm going to take care of you, all of the promises of, 700 plus promises in the Bible. When God says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. When God says, lo, I'm with you always. When God says, I shall supply all your needs. regardless to the reverses in life, regardless to the difficulties that I got to go through, that's God's problem, and that's not my problem. My problem is to do what God says. God's problem is to take care of me. And I believe what he says, neighbor. I got my faith in his word because God cannot lie. He can't lie. And we find it right here. And you notice how, take thy son, thine only son of whom thou lovest. Abraham loved that boy. Abraham loved that boy. But you know the story. Pull the knife back. He ready to cut the boy's throat. Angel sustained him. Lo, there is a ram caught in the bush. What's a ram? What is a ram, class? It's a male lamb. That's correct. The lamb is the animal of sacrifice. God, in his omnibenevolence, God, in his providential care, he's going to do what he said he's going to do. And as a result, now what we have, that seed, that messianic seed. You notice something? Genesis 17. There are several things that Abraham, you remember when Abraham told Hagar she got to go? And you remember what he gave Hagar when he told her she got to leave this house? A tent, the black goat had tents during that time. He gave her a thimble full of water and a morsel of bread and said, you got to get out of here. Now you sisters know there's never been a house large enough for two women. Hagar had to go. And you don't see Abraham crying or anything like that. Now, Abraham in Genesis 19, he did plead for Sodom. Did he not? Oh, if you can just find 50 righteous men, 40, 30. And Lot, because after you leave Abraham, and Abraham had a brother by the name of Haran, and that was Lot's father, Haran. And if Lot had to save his family, that would have been enough people, that would have been over 10 to save the city. Abraham pleaded for Sodom, did he not? Of course he did. Are you going to destroy God, the righteous, with this wicked city? He pleaded for him. But show me one time in Genesis 22 where Abraham pleaded for Isaac. It's not there. Because Abraham believed God. And when God made that promise to Abraham, Abraham was staking everything on it. Now, don't allow that bell to get you upset, because it's 50 chapters in the book of Genesis, and I'm just on. So now we come to Isaac. And of course, Isaac, great man, great marriage. Have those two boys. Some difficulty there. What was those two boys' names? Esau and Jacob. And we know what happened. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. Seed line is going to come through Jacob and those, of course, his 12 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Gad, Asher, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali. 12 tribes of Israel. That's what's going to come. So now you got that patriarchal situation keep on going from Genesis 11, the last verse, all the way to verse chapter 25. Then you pick up, of course, Isaac. And when you're studying Isaac, the record there will be chapters 26 through 30. Chapters 26 through 30. you get Isaac's record. And then, of course, Isaac's sons, as you correctly say, Esau and Jacob. Jacob going to carry that messianic seed line. And we study chapter 31 through 36. Chapters 31 through 36. You'll find that record, everything you need to know about this situation with Jacob. Then, of course, there are some things that happen now in chapter 30, of course, 37 through 50, Joseph, but you have to parenthetically insert here chapter 38 and chapters 49. Chapter 38 and chapter 49. Now, in chapter 38, you remember there is something happened between Judas and who? Tamar. You remember how she took off her widow's clothing, put on the clothing of the harlot, went down there on that square, and a kid goat was given to him. And now, wait a minute. Judas already had 3 boys, right? He already had 3 boys. Onan, and Shelah. And they were so wicked, God killed 2 of them on the spot. He already had 3 boys. God was not going to use them. But you know what happens? After that thing was consummated between Tamar and Judas, it was 2 twin boys born, Pharez and Zerah of Tamar. And they're going to be responsible for that messianic seed line. Then, of course, and we know the story of Joseph, the difficulties, how his brothers, not all of his brothers, 10 of those boys, sold him into slavery. Go over in Egypt. We know the situation that happens with him there. But of course, God is still preserving Genesis 3 and verse number 15. Let's see, can we sum something up here in the book of Genesis? In the book of Genesis, 50 startling chapters. We see 3 periods: antediluvian, post-diluvian, and then, of course, that patriarchal period. We see what happened from Genesis 3:6 forward. And God says something in verse number 15. I would put enmity, that is warfare. Enmity, warfare, something from the devil. The devil tried his best to stop Genesis 3 verse 15. Because if Genesis 3:15 get in the world, the minute Genesis 3:15 get in the world, then Satan is going to get his head busted. For this cause was the Son of God made known, that he might bring to naught the power of the devil. 1 John 3 and verse 8. Satan shall be crushed under your feet shortly. Romans 16:20. I know Satan is still out there, and he's bound. We've already read that to you in 2 Peter 2 and verse 4, Genesis 6, bound in chains. Well, how can he be bound if there's so much evil in the world? Well, you take a vicious Staffordshire Terrier, put him on a 10-foot chain, and as long as you stay outside of that 10 foot, those 10 feet, dog can't bite you. But if you get inside just 9 3/4, he'll get you. And so it is with Satan. We're not ignorant of his devices. 2 Corinthians 2. You know, I've seen my mother. I'm from rural Alabama. I've seen my mother wring a mini chicken's neck. Sure have. Now, the chickens we had when I was growing up, they're nothing like what's being stolen and sold in the stores now. I don't know what has happened, but I've never seen chickens as big as we got today. I've never seen a chicken that big. And I've seen my mother get that chicken and take it and wring the neck until the whole neck comes off the chicken. And I've seen the chicken try to get up and walk. I've seen the chicken snap and jump that high. And we are fascinated as children. And I never forget, my mother's still living, she's 87 years old, and I never forget the thing she said. Mama, he's going to get away. Look at him trying to walk away. Say, son, He ain't going nowhere. I got his head in my hand. And we got the devil's head in our hand, friend. Oh, he's kicking up a lot of fuss out there. Crime, drugs, gambling, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, you name it. He's kicking up a lot of fuss out there. But we don't have to worry about him. As long as we stay outside that 10 feet, we got his head in our hands. And that's exactly what Genesis 3:15 says. I would put enmity. That is warfare. Yes, the devil, that's his job, to try to get as many people lost. I will put enmity, warfare between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. I only touched the hem of the garment. I enjoyed the class. Thank you for listening.